April 1945. Somewhere in war-broken Western Germany, a cold wind moves through the shattered windows of a hospital that once smelled of disinfectant and promise. Now it reeks of damp concrete, burned wiring, and the metallic sting of fear. German nurses, exhausted and pale, weave between rows of wounded soldiers, some barely alive, others already beyond their reach. Supplies are gone. Bandages are torn sheets. Painkillers are a memory. The war has swallowed everything except duty. A distant rumble echoes outside, steady, heavy, unfamiliar. Not artillery, not the Wehrmacht. The nurses freeze. Boots pound the corridor. Weapons clatter. They brace for the enemy they've been warned about since the beginning. Ruthless Americans who would show no mercy. The doors burst open. But instead of gunfire, cartons of medical supplies are carried in. Hands offer water before questions. And the first English words spoken are soft. Let us help. For the first time in years, some of the nurses feel their eyes burn, not from smoke, your kider sekiman, ki tu feeder, but from the sudden weight of hope they never expected to receive. And as those tears fall, the story of how enemies became healers begins to unfold, ready to step back into the broader conflict that led them here. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing faster than anyone on the German home front could emotionally process. Hitler's promises of miracle weapons and final victory had evaporated under the relentless weight of Allied offensives. Entire cities, Cologne, Essen, Dortmund, Kassel, had been reduced to skeletons of concrete and smoldering brick. Transportation networks were shattered, fuel reserves drained, and command structures breaking apart. The war was no longer advancing outward, it was shrinking inward, suffocating its own people. Millions of civilians fled the oncoming Red Army in the east, flooding western regions with exhaustion, fear, and untreated wounds. Hospitals that once served tidy communities now struggled to care for a chaotic mix of frontline casualties, malnourished refugees, and the growing consequences of total war. Many facilities had been destroyed or evacuated under fire. Those still functioning suffered a deeper wound: isolation. Supply lines that once delivered bandages, anesthesia, disinfectants, and even food were severed. Doctors were conscripted. Students filled white coats they were barely trained to wear. Nurses, many in their early 20s, found themselves as the last barrier between life and death. At the same time, the Western Allies were moving with overwhelming force. After breaking through the Ruhr and crossing the Rhine in late March 1945, U.S. divisions rolled into Germany's industrial heartland. Their orders: dismantle the Nazi war machine, liberate POWs and concentration camps, and secure any towns that could still ignite resistance. But alongside infantry and armored columns came a quieter, less recognized army: the medical corps. Evacuation hospitals, portable surgical units, and ambulance companies accompanied the advance, ready to treat their own wounded and respond to what they found in captured German towns. And what they found was often shocking: hospitals and makeshift clinics overflowing, with wounded men left behind by retreating forces, civilians with bomb injuries or infections long untreated, starving children carried in by mothers who hadn't eaten in days, and German medical staff, exhausted, suspicious, yet still determined to do what little they could. Propaganda had taught them that Americans would shoot surrendered staff, steal supplies, or allow German patients to die. Instead, U.S. medics arrived offering penicillin, sterile instruments, food. It was not driven purely by compassion, though compassion blossomed there. It was also logistical necessity. A wounded population in chaos threatened stability and slowed the Allied advance. Healing the enemy became a strategic requirement. Yet, for those inside the hospital walls, strategy was the last thing on anyone's mind. The only question that mattered was whether life could still be saved in a world falling apart. And as the front lines dissolved and uniforms mattered less than suffering. The encounters that followed revealed how fragile wartime hatred truly was. Germany's medical system in 1945 was a paradox. Technologically advanced in theory, yet collapsing in practice. Before the war, German hospitals were among Europe's best equipped. But total war drained those resources into the military engine. As the Reich faltered, even military hospitals began to starve. The German Red Cross, Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, DRK, played a central role. Its nurses, many young, many ideologically pressured, served both civilian and military patients. They worked with pride, shaped by a culture of discipline and strict hierarchy. Yet, by 1945, their training could not overcome the reality. There were simply no supplies left. Ether, sulfa drugs, clean syringes, gone. Food rations, gone. Electricity, unreliable or destroyed entirely. Nurses improvised endlessly. They boiled the same dressings again and again until the fabric dissolved. They used shards of broken glass as scalpels. They whispered comfort to men begging for morphine that no longer existed. Their professional identity, healers with standards, was being brutally stripped away. Then came the Americans. The U.S. Army Medical Corps operated under a different doctrine. Wherever U.S. troops advanced, medical units followed, designed to be mobile and fully stocked. Field and evacuation hospitals carried vast quantities of penicillin, the new miracle drug. Blood plasma for transfusions, modern surgical kits and sterilizers, trucks to transport patients and supplies, warm blankets and nutritious food to the German nurses who encountered them. It must have felt like stepping into another world, a reminder of what medicine looked like before it collapsed under fascism and firebombing, yet their situation was legally complicated. Under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel of a defeated enemy could be treated as non-combatants if they surrendered. They could be retained as POWs, but must be allowed to continue caring for the wounded. They were entitled to safety, food, and respect for their professional roles. They were protected from punishment for doing their medical duty. Thus, in many captured towns, German nurses did not become prisoners in the usual sense. They became partners in emergency care, still wearing their Red Cross insignia while working with former enemies. But this cooperation came with emotional shock. The nurses had been told Americans were savage invaders. Instead, they found medical colleagues who lifted burdens they could no longer bear, and often treated German patients better than the Reich had in its final months. That collision between propaganda and humanity set the stage for powerful, unforgettable scenes of vulnerability and relief. Moments where tears replaced fear. Moments where helping hands crossed enemy lines. Moments that now lead us into the deeper angles of this story. Fear and collapse. Behind the white coats, for German nurses, courage had been a daily ritual long before the front reached their doors. They worked through bombing raids, power failures, and nights filled with screams. Many had watched friends and colleagues die from exhaustion, infection, or stray shells. The war had stretched them past the breaking point, yet they continued dressing wounds, holding trembling hands, and whispering the only comfort they still possessed. "You're not alone." When American soldiers arrived, that relentless emotional armor finally cracked. Enemies extended kindness they had not seen from their own collapsing authorities. It was a shock so deep it forced suppressed emotions to the surface. Guilt over lost patients, grief for fallen brothers, fear of retribution. Tears were not weakness. They were the release of years spent holding the world together as it crumbled around them. For the first time, someone else carried the burden. Two medical worlds collide. The U.S. Army believed mobility saved lives. Behind every division came a lifeline. ambulance trains, surgical trucks, blood plasma, portable X-ray equipment, and physicians trained in battlefield trauma. Their hospitals could unfold in minutes, tents rising like white islands amid ruin. Generator trucks brought power. Radios linked evacuation teams to forward aid posts. Patient flow was a system. Stabilize, operate, evacuate, rehabilitate. Germany had once pioneered such discipline. But in 1945, chaos ruled. Transportation networks were shattered. Supply convoys couldn't reach hospitals. Trained surgeons were fighting as riflemen. Orders came late, or not at all. So when Americans entered a German hospital, it wasn't just a change of flags, it was the return of structure. Charts reappeared. Triage resumed. Medicines were accounted for. Patients long written off were suddenly candidates for survival. War doesn't wait for healing. But in these places, healing fought back. Organized, relentless, efficient. A miracle called penicillin across the wards, the clearest difference was science. German medicine had been advanced, but crippled by shortages. They still relied heavily on sulfa drugs, primitive antiseptics, and transfusion methods limited by supply. Infection, the unseen killer, claimed countless lives. Then came the Americans, with boxes marked penicillin. It was the closest thing to magic the war ever produced. A shot into an infected leg that would have been amputated, and the fever broke. A dose for a collapsing patient, and breath steadied. Combined with plasma banks, modern sterilization, and surgical lighting rigs, U.S. medical care lifted men back from the edge with speed German staff had not witnessed in years. To nurses who had spent months watching wounds turn black and spirits fade, this was more than medicine. It was proof that the world outside the Reich still valued life. Fiercely, and that realization transformed how they saw the hands offering help. Orders wrapped in humanity, thy Tee. Allied advance into Germany was tightly controlled. Every captured facility, factories, schools, hospitals, required decisions from officers balancing military priority with civilian needs. Medical buildings were especially sensitive. The Geneva Convention demanded respect for staff who surrendered peacefully. So U.S. commanders issued clear directives. Protect German medical personnel, allow them to continue. Their work under supervision, provide supplies and oversight. To ensure civilian and POW patients received care, maintain security while minimizing humiliation. This created an unusual hierarchy inside hospital walls. German doctors who once took orders from the Wehrmacht now stood beneath American officers, yet retained authority in their wards. Cooperation became survival. Many U.S. medical officers recognized skill and dedication in their German counterparts. Some even praised their ability to persevere under catastrophic shortages. But there were hard decisions, too. Triage protocols required that the most salvageable were treated first, regardless of uniform. Severely wounded German soldiers were moved aside for Allied patients or civilians whose chances were higher. Some German staff accepted the logic. Others felt it as a crushing defeat of pride. Still, command insisted on discipline with compassion. "We are not here to punish the sick," one American colonel wrote. "We are here to end suffering, all of it." Those words, spoken through orders and actions, reshaped the atmosphere of capture into one of reluctant partnership. Propaganda meets reality for years. German civilians were bombarded with stories of American savagery. Nurses would be assaulted, patients executed, hospitals torched. Posters warned that surrender meant dishonor and death. The Reich needed fear to keep people fighting. Yet when American medical teams entered real hospitals, that narrative evaporated. A nurse who expected threats instead heard, "Where are your wounded? Show us who needs help first." A soldier who braced for torture received a blood transfusion. A child whimpering in a corner was wrapped in a GI's blanket and fed chocolate. The first sweet taste since the war began. This moral dissonance triggered emotional collapse. Shame that they had believed lies. Gratitude that felt forbidden. Relief so profound it hurt. Many nurses later confessed they saw, in the calm voices, efficient hands, and respectful gestures, colleagues, not conquerors. The enemy became human, and when humanity enters the room, ideology doesn't stand a chance. These moments, full of confusion, humility, and stunned tears, marked the turning point. A turning point that now leads us into the heart of this story. The decisive encounters where everything changed inside a single hospital. On a single day, when hope crossed the threshold wearing an American uniform. April 12, 1945. The wooded outskirts of Göttingen, Lower Saxony. A German military hospital clung to life inside what had once been a school. The Red Cross flag, faded and torn by wind, hung limply above the entrance. Inside were nearly 300 wounded soldiers and civilians, and just 19 nurses, most barely out of adolescence. At 09:10 hours, the first American patrol approached. Elements of the 104th Infantry Division. Timberwolves. Their mission was simple: secure the town, disarm any remaining resistance, and stabilize the civilian situation. But nothing was simple in 1945. The nurses braced themselves as boots echoed in the hallway. Some clutched rosaries. Others stood rigidly at attention, trying to hide shaking hands. Their senior matron, Sister Anna Kramer of the DRK, stepped forward, prepared to negotiate surrender and beg for the safety of her staff. What came instead was the arrival of U.S. Army Medical Detachment No. 12, commanded by Captain William Ross, a surgeon who had spent the last weeks working around the clock in makeshift aid stations. He took in the scene. Overwhelmed wards, gangrenous wounds, emaciated bodies. A slow disaster stretching beyond any battle line. He turned to his team and gave the only order that could matter: supplies to triage. Now. American medics rushed crates inside. Penicillin, sulfa, plasma bottles wrapped in ice. The German nurses watched, stunned, as gleaming surgical tools were unboxed and sterilizers fired to life with a growl of captured generators. For months, the hospital had been silent except for suffering. Now it hummed with purposeful energy. Captain Ross approached Sister Kramer gently. "Show us the ones who can't wait." She hesitated, not out of fear, but disbelief. For years, she'd been taught that Americans were destroyers. Yet here stood a man whose hands moved with urgency and empathy, not hostility. In Ward 3, a young German soldier lay dying of sepsis from a leg wound inflicted weeks prior. His fevered eyes flickered open as Captain Ross checked his pulse and called for penicillin. A nurse whispered, voice shaking. "He was already gone. We were just waiting." "No one's gone while we're still here," Ross replied. That moment, a foreign doctor refusing to surrender a German life, shattered the last barrier in Sister Kramer's heart. Tears welled up. Another nurse dropped to her knees beside the bed, overwhelmed by the impossible sight of hope returning. Around them, the lines between uniforms blurred. Medics and nurses moved as one. The battle outside still raged, but inside these walls, war paused. What happened next would seal the emotional reckoning. The moment kindness became more powerful than conquest, and the enemy became the healer Germany never expected. As word spread through the halls that the Americans had come not to punish, but to heal, emotions long buried surged to the surface. Nurses who had spent years watching hope bleed out now found themselves fighting tears while their hands worked automatically, passing instruments, securing IV lines, cleaning wounds that finally had a chance to close. In the operating room, a soldier with a shattered femur was prepped for surgery. German and American personnel stood shoulder to shoulder under the glare of a portable surgical lamp. A U.S. anesthetist instructed a German nurse to hold a mask delivering ether, something she hadn't had access to in months. When the patient slipped into painless sleep, she let out a quiet sob of relief. She tried to hide behind her shoulder. Across the corridor, Private Lucas Bauer, 17 years old, lay unconscious from blood loss. He had been injured during a desperate counterattack days before. U.S. medics inserted a plasma line, his color slowly returning from ghostly gray to a faint blush. One German nurse, unable to contain herself, whispered, "Das ist unmöglich. Kommt zurück. This is impossible. He's coming back." Meanwhile, Captain Ross noticed a cluster of terrified children in a corner room, refugees who had been taken in despite the hospital's overload. He crouched and held out ration bars. The children flinched at first, certain that the feared enemy meant harm. Only when a nurse nodded did they accept the food and chocolate. With wide, disbelieving eyes, a little girl clutched the captain's sleeve, refusing to let go. These scenes tore through years of propaganda in seconds. German nurses wept openly, not because they feared the Americans, but because they no longer needed to be strong every second. Someone else was finally helping carry the unbearable weight. One nurse collapsed into Sister Kramer's arms, sobbing, We told them Americans were monsters." Sister Kramer held her tightly, replying with a broken voice, "Perhaps we were the ones living in a nightmare." The Americans kept working, not pausing to absorb the emotional collapse happening around them. But they felt it, every trembling breath, every tear that hit the floor, every whispered danke that needed no translation. Outside, the war continued, artillery in the distance, the thunder of tanks rolling toward other towns in need. But inside the hospital, the front line shifted, from destruction to survival. This was the turning point, not measured in territory or weapons, but in bandages, transfusions, and fragile moments of shared humanity. A moment that now forces us to ask, what were the consequences of this unexpected mercy? For the nurses, the wounded, and the war itself. In the immediate days following the hospital's capture, order replaced desperation. American officers established a clear structure. Patients were categorized into 3 groups: Allied POWs, German military, and civilians. But treatment priority did not follow political hierarchy. The U.S. medics applied a single guiding principle: who has the best chance to survive if we act now? It was triage, strictly medical, not ideological. Those with treatable infections or manageable wounds were operated on first. The most gravely injured were kept comfortable, but efforts were focused where life could still be saved. Hard choices that German staff had been forced to abandon due to overwhelming demand now returned with discipline and clarity. The German nurses remained at their posts, but under American supervision. They were not treated as traditional POWs. As protected medical personnel under the Geneva Convention, they received their own living quarters. Food rations equal to hospital staff. Continued authority in basic nursing care, freedom of movement within the facility, respect for their uniforms and roles for many. It was the first time in months they went to sleep without the dread of artillery waking them. American officers documented the transformation. In one after-action report written by Major Frank Lewis, he noted, "The German hospital staff performed admirably under impossible conditions. Their resilience and willingness to cooperate once assisted was of great value." U.S. Army Medical Corps report, April 1945, another stated, "The enemy was not the nurses. The enemy was infection, hunger, and despair." Captain William Ross, personal field notes patients who had been written off as dying began to recover. Amputees who once awaited fatal infection were stabilized. Even the children, those without a country left, slowly regained the strength to laugh. Still, the situation carried tension. Some German doctors struggled with the shame of being rescued by their former enemy. Others clung to denial, insisting Germany would still turn the tide. But such illusions faded as U.S. and British convoys flooded captured towns with indisputable evidence of collapse. Intact rations, fuel, and medical supplies that German leadership had failed to deliver for months. In that hospital, a new reality set in. The war was ending, and survival depended not on politics, but on cooperation. A fragile peace had taken root in the rubble. But the story of what happened to those nurses and how these experiences shaped their lives after surrender was only just beginning. Weeks turned into months, and the immediate relief provided by the Americans began to evolve into longer-term consequences for the German nurses. Many remained in the hospitals, assisting Allied medical teams as the front stabilized and the flow of wounded decreased. Their professional skills, once constrained by shortages and wartime chaos, were now fully utilized. Penicillin, modern surgical instruments, and steady supply lines transformed patient outcomes. And the nurses themselves witnessed the stark contrast between war-torn medicine and organized care. Some nurses, like Sister Anna Kramer, were eventually allowed to return home under supervision. Their experiences, however, left indelible marks. Memoirs and oral histories recount that many struggled with guilt, both for surviving when others did not, and for the relief they felt in the presence of their former enemy. Yet, they also carried a profound recognition. Humanity could persist even across the lines of conflict. The psychological burden of having been rescued by those they had been taught to hate became a lens through which they viewed post-war life. The hospital's transformation also had a ripple effect. Reports from U.S. Army Medical Corps after-action summaries, April-June 1945, emphasized that cooperating with local medical personnel accelerated recovery and reduced mortality rates. Hospitals that integrated German nurses into triage and care reduced patient fatalities by measurable percentages, demonstrating that practical collaboration often outweighed ideology. In towns like Göttingen, liberated facilities became models for post-war reconstruction. Communities slowly rebuilt around functional hospitals staffed by a mix of German professionals and Allied medics. The DRK itself began to re-establish operations under Allied oversight, its personnel having learned new practices in sanitation, blood transfusion, and emergency logistics. Yet, not all consequences were positive. Some nurses faced suspicion or resentment from returning civilians who struggled to reconcile their enemy-assisted survival with nationalistic shame. Many left their old professions, opting instead for anonymity or emigration. Still, their experiences became a silent testament to the possibility of compassion under impossible circumstances. The events inside these hospitals, documented in field notes, photographs, and personal testimonies, set the stage for reflection on a larger question. What does it mean for enemies to become healers? And how does humanity persist when ideology collapses? These moments, tears, hands stretched across enemy lines, and lives saved, now lead into the final reflection on the enduring legacy of these encounters, both for medicine and for the human heart. In the quiet corridors of that hospital, war's chaos gave way to something fragile yet profound. The affirmation that even in the darkest hours, humanity could persist. The German nurses, once conditioned to fear and suspicion, discovered that mercy could cross uniform lines. The Americans, carrying supplies and skills forged in years of preparation, became instruments of survival rather than instruments of conquest. These encounters revealed the paradox of war. While destruction dominates the headlines, small acts of compassion determine who lives and who dies. Healing is never neutral. It carries moral weight, shaping hearts as much as bodies. A nurse's tear, a soldier's grateful glance, a child's tentative smile. These fleeting moments held more power than 1,000 guns. The story of these hospitals reminds us that ideology can crumble under the simplest truths. Pain does not recognize nationality, and suffering commands care, not enmity. In these spaces, uniforms mattered less than the pulse of a patient, less than the steadfast hands willing to save a life at any cost. And perhaps, most strikingly, the legacy of those days endured long after the last soldier departed. Survivors carried memory, knowledge, and a quiet understanding that even enemies could become healers, and even amidst devastation, hope could be offered, freely, without expectation. In the end, the hospital walls bore witness not to the triumph of one side over another, but to the enduring resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring truth that compassion is the war we must never abandon.